In this video, we want to talk about a couple of additional considerations we have when we're troubleshooting route redistribution for IP version 6. For the most part, the issues are similar, but there are a couple of additional things I want you to keep in mind beyond what we've already talked about. First, let's consider a router running some routing protocol. Let's say it's OSPF. And let's say that that router has several interfaces, and those interfaces are participating in OSPF. And let's say that that router is doing a route redistribution of OSPF into another routing process. With IP version 4, the interfaces on that router that are participating in OSPF, they are going to be redistributed, but that's not the case by default with IP version 6. With IP version 6, we have to specify an additional parameter to say that we want to redistribute connected networks. Now, route redistribution works on the premise that in order to redistribute a route into another routing protocol, that route has to exist in the IP routing table. And if we take a look at an IP routing table, if I have an interface on that router that is participating in OSPF, yeah, the network attached to that interface is going to show up in the IP routing table, but not because it was learned via OSPF. It shows up because it's a directly connected network. And if we're doing IP version 4 route redistribution, it understands that, yes, this interface, it is connected, but it's participating in the routing process, so I'm going to redistribute that as well. But with IP version 6, that does not happen. With IP version 6, if I say, for example, that I want to redistribute all of my OSPF learned routes into another routing process, or all of my EIGRP learned routes into another routing process, those routes that I'm redistributing not only need to show up in the IP routing table, they need to show up in the IP routing table because they were learned by OSPF or EIGRP, or whatever routing protocol is doing the redistribution. But usually we will want to also redistribute networks connected to interfaces that are participating in that routing process. And when we go out to a live interface in a moment, I'm going to show you the extra parameter we have to give to do that. And here's another difference when we're doing route redistribution with IP version 6 as opposed to IP version 4. Remember with IP version 4, when we were redistributing into OSPF, we said that we would normally want to give the subnets option. Without the subnets option, the only networks that were going to be redistributed into OSPF were networks that had their classful mask. But now we're talking about redistributing into OSPF version 3, which gives us IPv6 support. And with IPv6, there's no concept of a subnet or a classful network, so we don't have to worry about giving the subnets option. And to demonstrate a mutual route redistribution configuration for IP version 6, let's go to router R2. Here on router R2, let's set up mutual route redistribution for IPv6 between OSPF and EIGRP. Specifically, OSPF version 3 and EIGRP for IPv6. I've already got those routing protocols configured on routers R1, R2, and R3. Now let's configure route redistribution. Let's go into global configuration mode and then into IPv6 router EIGRP configuration mode for autonomous system 1. And let's say that we want to redistribute into this EIGRP autonomous system our OSPF version 3 routes. Let's give the redistribute command. And I'll say I want to redistribute OSPF process ID 1, and I'll set the metric, because remember the default metric for EIGRP is infinity. It looks like we're on a serial link, so I will set the bandwidth to a T1 speed, 1.544 megabits per second. I'll set the delay to 10, where the unit of measure is in tens of microseconds. I'll say that I am 100% reliable, I am minimally loaded, and I've got a default MTU. And if I were setting up route redistribution for IP version 4, I might be done right now. However, here I want to give this extra option. I want to say include -connected. What I'm saying is I want to redistribute networks from any interfaces on this router that are enabled for OSPF. Those networks are not in the IP routing table because they were learned via OSPF. They're directly connected networks. But I do want to redistribute those, and to make that happen, I say include -connected. Now let's redistribute EIGRP learned routes into OSPF. Let's go into OSPF version 3 router configuration mode by saying IPv6 router OSPF process ID 1, and I'll say redistribute EIGRP autonomous system 1. And if I give context sensitive help, you'll see that there is no subnets option because IPv6 has no concept of subnets. I do want to say include -connected though, just like we did for OSPF routes that were being redistributed into EIGRP. And we're done with our route redistribution configuration. Let's see if it works. Let's go over to router R1 and issue a show IPv6 route command. And you can see that we have learned a couple of networks via route redistribution. We learned about the network between routers R2 and R3, and we learned about the network connected off of R3's Fast Ethernet 0/0 interface. Now let's go to router R3 and see if we've learned about any OSPF learned routes that have been redistributed into EIGRP. I'll do a show IPv6 route command, and we do have a couple. This is the network connected off of router R1's Fast Ethernet 0/0 interface, and this network is the network between routers R1 and R2. And that's a look at a couple of differences that we should keep in mind when we're doing route redistribution with IP version 6 as opposed to IP version 4. And again, there is no subnets option when we're redistributing with IP version 6. And also we might want to add that include -connected option when we're doing redistribution, which will cause directly connected networks that are enabled for that routing process to also be redistributed.